At first, it looked like a careless accident, the kind the park writes off as heat, bad footing, and people pushing past their limits. In 2019, in McKittrick Canyon at Guadalupe Mountains National Park, Texas, a hiker stumbled out of a dry wash with a plastic tie cutting into his wrist and dust packed into the corners of his mouth. He wasn't limping like he'd twisted an ankle. He was moving like someone had shoved him forward and told him not to stop. He kept glancing uphill, over his shoulder, at the pale limestone and the scrubby ledges, like he expected a person to step out from behind the rock and finish what had started. 2 hours earlier, he had watched 3 people walk ahead of him on the trail, steady and normal, the way strangers look when you only see them from behind. Now, one pack sat open in the sand as if it had been set down carefully, not dropped. A water bottle rolled back and forth in the wind, making a soft plastic tick each time it bumped a stone. Farther up, a bright strip of flagging hung from a branch that should have been bare, tied in a clean knot that didn't belong in a national park unless a ranger put it there. The hiker tried his phone. No service. He tried to shout. His throat only made a weak rasp, and the sound died in the canyon walls. When he moved toward the flagging, a hidden camera turned with him, slow and patient, as if it had been waiting all morning and had nowhere else to be. The lens didn't blink. It didn't need to. By the time he reached the parking lot, the other cars were still there, lined up in neat rows as the sun climbed. The other hikers were not. Somewhere above the trail, the man who'd done it watched through another lens, already choosing the next person to follow today, quietly, like this was a routine he'd refined. Let me walk you through what really happened that day, because the first version people tell always sounds wrong. It turns the whole thing into a campfire story, or it makes the victims sound careless, and neither of those is true. The truth is worse, because the truth is ordinary. The truth is that a normal place on a normal morning can be used by someone who plans like a mechanic and waits like a hunter. At the time, I was 34, and I hiked the way other people went to bars or scrolled their phones. I wasn't training for anything big. I wasn't chasing a record or a summit list. I had a long weekend, a cheap motel in Carlsbad, and the kind of stress that settles into your jaw and shoulders when you sit at a desk too long, pretending your life is fine. I worked a job that paid well and felt like sand in my teeth. Hiking was how I stayed calm without having to explain myself to anyone. My name is Eli Carver, and I drove to the trailhead before sunrise because I'd learned something simple about desert parks. If you start late, the heat doesn't forgive you. The lot still held the night's cool when I pulled in. My headlights washed over the kiosk, the map board, and the flat, empty spaces between parked cars. There were 3 other vehicles already there, all backed in, which always catches my eye because it means the driver's expected to leave quickly, or they'd done this enough times to develop habits. One of the cars had a paper taped inside the windshield. I couldn't read it from where I stood, but I saw a thick, hand-drawn arrow and the word back written twice, like somebody wanted to make sure it landed. It wasn't a printed notice. It wasn't park letterhead, just marker on plain paper pressed against glass. I told myself it was a private note, maybe a reminder between friends. Back by noon. Back by the cabin. Something like that. I didn't have enough information to be alarmed, and most of the time, you shouldn't be. The problem is that people like the man in this story rely on that instinct. They rely on you being reasonable. My coworker Mark showed up a few minutes later, and he was the reason I didn't hike alone that day. He pulled in beside me in his truck, got out with a grin and a travel mug, and shut the door with a happy slam like the world was simple. He was 36, broad-shouldered, and always a little too loud for the moment. He'd asked to come because he'd just gotten dumped and needed distraction. He didn't say it like a wound. He said it like a scheduling problem he wanted to solve. "You ready to sweat?" he asked, lifting the mug like a toast. "I'm ready to feel like a person," I said, and I meant it. Mark laughed. He wore new boots, the kind that still looked stiff and clean. You could tell he hadn't broken them in, and I gave him the look I always give people with new boots. "They're fine," he said. "I wore them around the house." "That's not the same," I said. "It's close enough," he said, and that was Mark. He would rather be optimistic than correct. We walked over to the kiosk, shoulder to shoulder, and scanned the posted warnings. Heat. Stay on trail. Watch your water. Keep an eye on footing in the wash. The usual stuff that reads like common sense until you're tired and thirsty and your brain starts bargaining. There was also a smaller notice pinned crooked, like it had been added in a hurry. It mentioned a temporary closure on a side path near a wash. No long explanation, no dramatic language, just a date, a reference point, and a short line telling visitors to avoid unofficial flagging and to report it to a ranger. Mark tapped it with one finger. "Flagging like survey tape?" he said. "Yeah," I said. "Someone's marking something they shouldn't." He shrugged. "We're on the main trail. We'll be fine." A couple came up behind us while we stood there, quiet and focused. Late 20s, day packs, sun hats, the kind of people who looked like they planned. The guy nodded at us with a polite, early morning face. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Mark answered, cheerful. The woman smiled. "You two going up to the grotto?" "That's the idea," I said. "Same," the guy said. "We're trying to be back before it gets ugly." Mark tipped his mug at them. Smart. We started up the canyon while the light still sat low and flat. The walls were pale and clean, layered limestone that looked almost white in the early sun. The ground underfoot shifted from hard-packed dirt to gravel and back again, and every now and then the trail narrowed where rock pushed in. The air smelled dry, like warm stone that hadn't heated yet. At about 7:10 a.m., we passed the first shaded bend, and it felt like walking into a different day. The temperature dropped. A thin line of water lay in the creek bed in places, not enough to call a stream, just enough to remind you that the canyon held its own weather. Leaves grew where you didn't expect them, and that contrast, green against pale rock, always made the place feel less like a desert and more like a corridor to somewhere else. Mark kept up a steady stream of talk about his ex, his boss, his knee, his new boots, and the injustice of being dumped by someone who didn't even have a reason. I let him go. It was better than silence, and it kept him from focusing too hard on the heat. About a mile in, I saw the first strip of bright flagging. It hung chest-high from a scrub branch, tied in a neat bow. The color was loud against the rock and leaves, the kind you can spot from a distance. It didn't match anything official. Parks use signs and posts. They don't tie bright tape in bows like party favors. I stopped and stared at it longer than I should have. Mark noticed and followed my eyes. "That's what the notice meant," he said. The couple slowed too. The woman frowned. "That's weird," she said. "It's fresh." The guy leaned his head slightly, studying the way the loose ends angled. "And it's pointing off trail," he said. He was right. The bow's tails weren't random. They pointed toward a narrow gap between rocks where a faint path broke away, not wide enough to be a maintained route, just scuffed dirt and broken plants. It looked like one of those "I'll just take a quick look" detours that gets people sprained ankles and rescue bills. Mark smiled like he'd found something fun. "Maybe it's a shortcut to a viewpoint." I shook my head. "Or it's someone's private marker. We stay on the trail." Mark took 2 steps toward the gap anyway, half joking, testing how far he could push before I got serious. "Mark," I said, sharper than I meant. He held up his hands. Okay. I'm not trying to get us in trouble." The couple moved on. The guy called back, casual, "See you at the top." We kept walking, but the flagging stayed in my mind like a pebble in a shoe. A single strip could be trash. 2 strips could be an idiot with a roll of tape. But the knot was too neat, and the placement was too deliberate. It had purpose. 10 minutes later, there was another strip, higher up this time, like someone had to reach above their head to tie it. Same bright color, same careful knot. That was when Mark stopped making jokes. "That's a lot of effort," he said. "Or a lot of practice," I said. We passed a sandy wash where the trail widened. The sand was rippled from wind and crossed with old footprints, most of them blurred. In the middle of it, I saw an empty water bottle and a torn snack wrapper. Trash is normal. People drop things. But these looked placed, not dropped, sitting a little too centered, a little too visible. Mark crouched and touched the wrapper with 2 fingers. "It's still kind of stiff," he said. "Not sun-baked." "Leave it," I said. "Not our job." He set it back down, but he looked annoyed, like the world owed him a clean experience because he'd driven out here early and carried water. Around 8:20 a.m., we rounded a bend and found a day pack sitting on a flat rock beside the trail. It was open. One strap had been pulled tight under the rock like someone had anchored it. That detail made my stomach tighten, because nobody sets a pack down like that by accident. Mark's voice dropped. "That's not normal." I stepped closer without touching it. The pack was a decent brand. Inside I saw a rolled windbreaker and a first aid kit. The zipper pulls looked clean. No dust, no sign it had been dragged. The couple wasn't far ahead. I could still see them, two figures moving in and out of shadow as the trail curved. Mark raised his voice. "Hey!" The guy turned and walked back, cautious now, like he'd heard something in Mark's tone that wasn't joking. "What's up?" he asked. Mark pointed at the pack. "Did you see this?" The guy's face tightened. "No." The woman came back too. She took one look and put a hand over her mouth, not from disgust, but from a sudden fear she didn't want to show. "That could be someone's," she said, and her voice sounded thin in the canyon. "It is someone's," I said, "and it's sitting like a sign." The guy pulled out his phone and stared at it as if willpower could make bars appear. "No service." "Same," Mark said. I scanned up and down the trail. It felt too open, too staged, like a place meant for something. That sounds dramatic now, but in the moment it was just a pressure in my chest and the sense that the canyon had become a hallway with doors I couldn't see. "We should head back," the woman said. The guy nodded immediately. "Yeah, we should." Mark didn't move. His eyes kept flicking to the gap where the flagging pointed, back the way we'd come, the faint path that promised answers in trouble. "What if they went that way?" he said. "What if someone's hurt?" I hated that he was right enough to make it hard. If you see something that looks like a person in trouble, your brain starts building rules about what decent people do. The problem is that decency can be exploited. "Then we don't split up," I said. "We go together, we go a short distance, and we come back. We do not turn this into a rescue mission. We just check." The couple exchanged a look. The woman's eyes said no. The guy's eyes said he didn't want to look like a coward. "We'll go a little," the guy said, and the way he said it sounded like he was making himself do it. We stepped off the main trail into the gap. The path wasn't really a path. It was scuffed dirt and broken plants, moving along the base of a wall and then dropping into a shallow wash. Within 50 yards, the canyon swallowed the light. The walls tightened. The air turned still, the kind of still that makes you aware of your own breathing. Mark muttered, "This is dumb." "Then we stop," I said. He didn't stop. He kept going, eyes on the next strip of flagging like it was a breadcrumb trail. That strip hung from a branch that shouldn't have been there. The branch looked cut and wedged into a crack in the rock, like somebody had planted it. The bark was wrong for the spot, and the cut end looked too fresh. The woman noticed it too. "That's staged," she said, and now her fear wasn't hidden. The guy stepped close, then froze, pointing down. "Footprints," he said. The sand held clear tread marks, more than one set. Some looked fresh, sharp-edged. Some looked older, pressed deep and softened by time. And there were drag marks, short, interrupted lines, like something heavy had been pulled a few feet and then lifted, or like a person had been dragged and then made to stand. Mark swallowed hard. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we go back now." A faint glint caught my eye on the rock face, about shoulder height. It wasn't a piece of random metal. It was too deliberate, tucked into a crack, angled toward the wash. I leaned in just enough to confirm what my brain already knew. A camera, not a park camera. No sign, no warning, no official mount. Just a small, dark device with a glass eye, hidden the way someone hides something they don't want found. "Back," I said. "Now." We turned at the same time, and Mark hissed and grabbed his left calf. "What?" I said, and my voice came out sharp. "Something got me," he said, stumbling. I saw it immediately. A thin wire looped low across the wash, anchored on both sides with rocks. Mark had stepped into it and pulled it tight. It didn't cut him open, but it bit hard enough to make him yelp and lose his balance. It was set at ankle height for one reason: to drop a person fast, to make them fall, to make them panic and look down instead of looking ahead. The couple backed up, eyes wide. "I'm fine," Mark said, even as he bent over his leg. Just stung." "Don't touch it," I said. I crouched, picked up a stick, and lifted the wire away carefully, like it might have another surprise tied to it. Then I motioned Mark through. We started back toward the gap, moving faster now, the kind of fast that isn't running yet, but is close. A man stepped into view at the mouth of the wash. He stood where the main trail should have been, blocking the exit like he'd been waiting for us to turn around. He wore a brimmed hat and sunglasses, and his shirt looked like it might have been a work shirt once. Neutral color, long sleeves, nothing that screamed danger. Not a uniform, but close enough to make your brain hesitate for half a second, wondering if he belonged there. He held something in his hand. At first, my mind tried to label it as a tool, because that's safer. Then the shape resolved into what it was, a handgun. Nobody screamed. People imagine screams. What you get is a blank second where your brain refuses to process the new rules. The canyon looked the same. The sunlight still hit the rock. The air still smelled like warm stone. But the world had shifted. The man spoke in a calm voice, conversational, like he was giving directions to lost tourists. "Phones won't work," he said. "Don't waste time." The woman clutched her chest strap. "What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, like he was listening, not to us, but to something else. Maybe a sound cue, maybe a device, maybe the simple quiet he designed. "Hands where I can see them," he said. "All of you." Mark's face went pale. "We didn't take anything." The man didn't answer that. He took one slow step forward, and the gun stayed steady, not waving, not dramatic. That steadiness was what made him feel practiced. "Back up," I said, and I knew it was pointless even as I said it. He smiled, small and tired. "You're not going anywhere." My mind grabbed at details because details make fear manageable. His boots were dusty. His hands didn't shake. His clothes were sun-faded, like he spent a lot of time outside. He didn't look excited. He looked like a person doing a job. He wasn't an animal. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man who had planned. "Turn around," he said. "Walk deeper, nice and easy." The guy in the couple shook his head once like a reflex. "No." The man's arm lifted a few inches. Not dramatic. Just a correction, a reminder. The woman whispered, "Please." And it wasn't a negotiation. It was a plea for reality to rewind. The man ignored her and nodded toward the wash behind him. "Move." We moved, because the muzzle decided the order of the world. He guided us deeper, past the planted flagging, past the hidden camera, past a bend where the walls tightened enough to scrape your shoulders if you turned sideways. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He owned the terrain, and he knew it. He'd chosen it. Then he stopped at a narrow slot between rocks. "Single file," he said. The slot led to a low overhang, like a shallow cave. Inside, the air was cooler, and the ground was packed down the way ground gets when feet and knees have been there a lot. Someone had used the place repeatedly. That was the moment the situation stopped being a random threat and became something else, a system. On a flat stone, I saw a coil of plastic ties. I saw duct tape. I saw two backpacks stacked neatly in a corner, not ours. One had a keychain dangling from it, bright and cheerful, like it belonged to someone who had expected a normal day. The couple saw it too. The woman's eyes filled and spilled, silent crying that made her shoulders shake. The guy's jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. The man pointed at Mark. "Kneel." Mark hesitated just long enough to make it matter. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was trying to make sense of a command that didn't belong in his life. The man stepped closer and struck Mark across the side of the head with the gun, quick and efficient. Mark dropped hard, not out cold, not gone, just stunned, on the ground, eyes unfocused, making a sound that was half breath and half disbelief. The guy surged forward on instinct. "Don't touch him," he said, and his voice cracked. The man turned and fired once into the dirt near the guy's foot. The shot was loud in the enclosed space, a sharp crack that bounced off stone and turned my stomach. Dust jumped up. We all froze. "Next one's not dirt," the man said, still calm, like he was explaining a rule to children. He grabbed Mark's wrist and cinched a tie tight, fast, practiced. Mark groaned and tried to pull away, but his coordination wasn't there. "Eli," Mark said, and the way he said my name wasn't dramatic. It was confused, like he couldn't accept that this was happening in daylight. I did something I still replay because it was the only move my body offered, and it was partly desperation and partly calculation. I looked down at the coil of ties and said, "Take mine, too." The man's eyes flicked to my hands. That was the first time I saw him make a mistake, and it was a small one. He assumed my compliance meant control. He stepped in close enough that I could smell sweat and old sunscreen on him. That sour, stale smell of a person who lives outside. He reached for my wrist. I drove my elbow into his forearm and shoved past him toward the slot. The couple moved at the same time, pure panic, bodies colliding in the narrow space. Someone's shoulder hit stone, someone stumbled. The man shouted a sharp command and grabbed at my pack strap. The strap ripped with a loud tear. I kept moving because stopping would have meant being caught. Outside the overhang, the wash opened up. I ran low, using rocks as visual cover, not because stone would stop a bullet reliably, but because it gave my mind a job and made me less of a clear target. Another shot cracked behind me. It hit stone. Dust burst near my shoulder, and I felt grit slap my cheek. I didn't look back. Looking back is how you slow down, and slowing down is how you get taken. I hit the planted branch with the flagging and tore it down as I ran. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wanted to erase his signs. Maybe I wanted to leave a sign of my own. Maybe I wanted to hurt his system, even in a tiny way. The wash forked. I chose left and regretted it immediately, because the left fork funneled into a dead end with a drop that would break a leg if you tried it. I turned back, heart hammering, and saw him at the fork, steady, walking, not running. He wasn't in a hurry. He believed time belonged to him, and in that terrain, he was almost right. My phone still showed no service. I shoved it back into my pocket anyway. A useless object can still be a comfort when you don't have better options. I spotted the hidden camera again on the wall, the small dark eye aimed at the wash. It made my skin crawl, not because it was mysterious, but because it meant he watched people the way other people watch weather. He didn't need to chase everyone. He needed to monitor, predict, and intercept. I grabbed a rock, not huge, just heavy enough to matter, and threw it hard at the camera as I ran. It struck the wall and snapped the camera loose. The device dropped into the sand with a dull thud. The man flinched, not from fear, but from anger. His head turned sharply toward where it fell. He didn't like his tools being touched. He raised the gun again. I dove behind a boulder and crawled along the base of the wall, fingers scraping dirt, trying to make myself smaller than his line of sight. My chest burned. My mouth tasted like metal, that dry panic taste that shows up when your body dumps adrenaline into everything. I found a gap under a low pour-off, a place where water had carved a shallow tunnel. It wasn't much, but it was cover. I squeezed in, chest pressed to the ground, elbows tucked, trying to make my body fit the stone. My wrist stung. That's when I looked down and saw the plastic tie cinched there. He'd gotten it on me in the scramble without me noticing. It wasn't fully tight, but it was tight enough to remind me who was chasing me, and the thin bite of it made my hands clumsy. I heard him move closer, slow steps on gravel. He stopped near the boulder. "Come out," he said. "You're making it worse." I held my breath until my lungs burned, because sometimes silence is the only defense you have. A shadow crossed the mouth of the gap. He crouched and peered in, sunglasses reflecting nothing useful. For a second, I thought he had me because people always think hiding is a movie trick, but real hiding is crude and desperate, and it usually fails. He reached one hand into the gap, feeling, fingers searching the way you search for a dropped key. His fingertips brushed my boot. I kicked hard, straight into his wrist, and wriggled backward like an animal. He jerked his arm out and made a low sound, not a scream, more of an irritated grunt. I used that second to slip out the far side of the pour-off, scraping my shoulders on stone, and scrambled into the open. I ran again, not with style, not with grace, just with the simple goal of putting distance and angles between me and him. I ran until the canyon widened and the main trail came back into view like a lifeline. The maintained path looked unreal for a second, as if it belonged to a different world where rules existed. I didn't stop at the abandoned pack. I didn't stop at the water bottle. I didn't stop to call out for Mark or the couple because I knew what would happen if I stopped. I hated myself for that, but I also knew that if I got caught, nobody would get help. When I hit the trailhead at about 10:40 a.m., I almost fell onto the pavement. The lot shimmered with heat now, the sun higher, the shadows shorter. The other cars were still there. The couple's car, Mark's truck, another sedan I didn't recognize. No people, no ranger, no helpful stranger standing around asking what happened. I yanked my door open and fumbled for my keys. My hands shook so badly I dropped them once and had to crouch in the gravel to pick them up, lungs heaving like I'd sprinted a mile, which I probably had in broken pieces. My phone still showed no service. I drove fast, tires spitting gravel, heading toward the visitor center like it was a hospital. My brain kept trying to replay the overhang, the ties, the backpacks, the calm voice. It didn't fit with the brightness outside. It didn't fit with the clean map board and the warning signs about water and heat. At the first spot where my phone caught a bar, just one weak bar that flickered like it might disappear, I dialed 911. My voice came out wrong. Too fast, too thin. "There's a man with a gun in McKittrick Canyon," I said. "He has people. He shot at me. My friend is still there." The dispatcher did what dispatchers do when they're good. She kept me talking. She asked for landmarks, for descriptions, for anything that could be verified. She asked where exactly I'd left the main trail, what I'd seen, what direction the man had moved, what he looked like, what he said. I gave clean facts because facts were all I had. I told her about the flagging, the planted branch, the wire loop, the hidden camera. When I pulled into the visitor center lot, a parked truck was already moving, a ranger leaning into the cab radio as if the vehicle had been running for a while. 2 rangers came out, faces set, hands busy with radios and gear. One of them, a woman with sun-leathered skin and a brimmed hat, looked at my wrist and immediately stepped closer. "Stay with us," she said. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," I said, and my mouth tried to downplay it because downplaying felt like control. "It's not nothing," she said. "Sit." They sat me down in the shade and cut the plastic tie off my wrist with a small tool. The skin underneath was raised and red, and the moment the pressure released, blood welled in a thin line. It wasn't dramatic, but it was proof. They wrapped it quickly, practiced, the way people wrap cuts all day in parks where visitors slip and scrape. Within minutes, another vehicle arrived. A sheriff's deputy stepped out with a rifle case. More rangers followed, and the whole scene shifted into something organized. Radios crackled. Names were exchanged. Someone pointed at the map board and traced routes with a finger. They asked me the same questions again, not because they doubted me, but because they needed clean facts. They needed a statement that could be repeated without turning into rumor. I told them about the knot style on the flagging, the height it had been tied, the way the man spoke, the sunglasses, the steady hands, the trail cameras. When I said camera, the woman ranger's eyes narrowed in a way I'll never forget. "We've had missing hikers," she said. "Not many. Enough." My stomach dropped. "How many?" She didn't answer that directly. She looked past me toward the canyon, as if counting wasn't the point in that moment. They moved fast. They split into teams. They told me to stay put. I didn't. I stayed near enough to be a problem and far enough to not interfere because Mark was my friend and because sitting in shade while he lay on the ground somewhere inside that wash made me feel sick. The rangers didn't like it, but they had bigger priorities than arguing with me as long as I didn't cross their perimeter. By early afternoon, they found the overhang. I didn't see Mark right away. I saw a boot first, half buried in sand, the tread dusty. I saw the strap of his pack and the way it lay too still. A ranger held me back with a hand on my chest. "No," she said, firm, and there was no negotiation in it. The deputy went in. He came back out with a look that told me enough before any words did. Mark didn't walk out of that canyon. The couple didn't either, not right away. They found the man's camp tucked behind rocks, not a movie cave full of trophies, just a small hidden setup with water jugs, food, a sleeping pad, and a crate of cameras. Real cameras, trail cameras, the kind hunters use, mounted low and angled to catch faces. He'd been watching the canyon for a long time. He'd mapped people's habits. He'd learned where they stepped off trail and where they panicked. He'd built a system that used curiosity and decency as bait. He tried to run when they closed in. He didn't get far. He couldn't outrun people who knew the park and were moving with purpose. When they brought him out, his sunglasses were gone. His eyes looked normal. That was the worst part. There was no monster in his face, no obvious madness, just a man who looked like he could stand in line at a store and make small talk. He looked at me once, like he was checking whether I'd speak, whether I'd plead, whether I'd give him anything he could use. I didn't. I couldn't find words that didn't feel useless. They found the woman from the couple before sunset, tied and hidden in a narrow crack behind brush, alive and shaking so hard she couldn't stand at first. They carried her out carefully and talked to her in low, steady voices, the way you talk to someone who has been dropped into a nightmare while awake. They found the guy later, down in the wash, too still. They covered him quickly, respectfully, and they didn't let me see more than that, which I'm grateful for. They also found an older man I'd never seen, dehydrated and barely conscious, tucked into a shadowed notch like someone had stored him there for later. 3 missing people in one day, and that's only the ones on that trail. That's what I mean when I say the truth is ordinary and worse. It wasn't a legend, it wasn't a curse. It was a person who treated a public place like his private trapline, and he got away with it as long as people stayed polite and optimistic. I gave my statement as the light faded and the canyon cooled. I watched the rangers box up the cameras like evidence, each device sealed and labeled, each one a tiny witness that had been watching without helping. One of the rangers held a camera up and showed me the lens, the little glass circle no bigger than a fingernail. "This is how he picked," she said. My wrist throbbed where the plastic tie had been, and the ache felt like an echo more than an injury. When I finally drove away, the canyon sat quiet behind me, clean and bright, like it had done nothing at all. The park looked the way parks are supposed to look. Beautiful, open, honest. That's what makes it so hard to explain to people who weren't there. I still think about that camera turning in the crack, steady as a clock, and how it had been there before we ever arrived. I think about the bright flagging tied in neat bows, the way it pointed like a friendly hint. I think about how close we came to hiking past it and never knowing what it meant until it was too late. And I think about Mark's voice in that overhang, saying my name like he expected the world to make sense,